There's an interesting teaching here in this gospel reading dealing with ecclesiology, understanding the foundations of the church. Matthew, Mark, and Luke name the 12 apostles. Interestingly, the Gospel of John gives little attention to the 12. The notion of the 12 was very important in the early church, since what Jesus announced the new Israel. So we have the 12 tribes of Israel, and now Jesus announces a new Israel, and therefore the 12. The number 12 was very important to replace the 12 tribes of Israel. You'll find in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, the early church comes together and they say, we need to have 12, and since Judas Iscariot has departed, we need to come together to replace him. And they cast lots, and the lot falls on Matthias. What's interesting about the 12, clearly even in the letters of Paul, the 12 are very important. In St. Paul's first letter to Corinth, he mentions that after the resurrection, Jesus appears to Cephas, that's Peter, and then he appears to the 12, and after that he appears to many others. But he mentions specifically the importance of the 12. What's interesting about the 12 is that we really, we know exactly Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the first ones, they are remembered in all three accounts of who they are. But when you get down toward the last 3 or 4, they're not sure. Now, they're remembering like 40, 50 years later who the 12 were, get a little bit mixed up with the last ones. And also, in the first chapter of John's Gospel, there's a very deliberate calling of Nathanael from Cana in Galilee. And Jesus gives him perhaps the greatest compliment given to anybody in the Gospels. He said, this man is a true Israelite, there is no guile in him. So it's a very specific calling of Nathanael. And yet, Nathanael is not mentioned in all 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they call the 12. There's a presumption Bartholomew is Nathanael. Okay. We do not know what happens to the 12. They all wander. I mean, there's tradition that Thomas went to India. It's a good tradition, but there's no kind of critical history to confirm that. I mean, we have a tradition that he went to India. We don't know what happened to the 12. We know what happened to Peter. He went to Rome, he was crucified, and he's buried under St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But the others, we really don't know with any critical history what exactly happened to them. That in itself is important, because they are not what counts in the narratives of the gospel. What counts is Jesus Christ. Apostles and disciples and witnesses come and they go, but Jesus Christ endures. And the Gospels are shaped on the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to tell us about Jesus Christ, not to tell us about who the apostles were or whatever happened to them. What's also interesting about this mention of 12 here in the Gospel today is they're first sent out to heal, to drive out evil spirits and things like that, but they are not sent to teach. They will only be sent out to teach after the death and resurrection of Jesus. You'll find, we're reading Matthew here in the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, which is the very end. Jesus calls his disciples to Galilee, to the mountain in Galilee. And then he says to go into the whole world, baptize people, teaching them all that I have told you. So the teaching of Jesus has to come later. And it cannot come until they have experienced the death and resurrection of Jesus. It cannot come until they have failed and been renewed by the Holy Spirit, until the Holy Spirit comes upon them and renews them in their faith, until they embrace the suffering of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. They cannot teach. They have no preaching to do until much later. So here is the first sending out, but they're sent out to do all sorts of good things, but not to teach. We might want to keep that in mind. Only a suffering church can teach. Only a church that fails and is led by the Spirit, that's the only church that can preach. I mean, the perfect church and the perfect church, you have to go through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ in your life. You have to experience failure and call on the Spirit. You have to be broken. We'll deal with that when Sunday's gospel comes up about the scattering of the seed, and that will come up on Sunday. But it's very important to keep in mind, because until we are somehow reduced and renewed by the Spirit, until we have experienced the suffering of Jesus, the death and resurrection in some way in our lives, we are not sent to preach the gospel, to witness the word of Jesus Christ. I want to keep that in mind. So we are led to this teaching here by a reflection on who the 12 were in the gospel today.